18th already of May. I'm going to be your host, Durnford. This is a show I put together 4 or 5 years, almost 5 years ago. It's the first month of Fukushima headlines and stories. I got a whole bunch of folders that I've never got to. And I spent all day working on the show for the night, and then switched gears at supper time. I said, I'm going to do one of those old shows that takes us back to days that everybody probably forgot. And these are fantastic stories. I put headlines below the video so you can look them up yourself later or whenever it's convenient. Yeah, so this is an appropriate picture for the night. Fukushima's like eating a banana. That actually fits right in with the original story when it came out. Hope everybody's doing well. Looks like everything is running good. We'll just go right ahead. There's a lot to get through, unfortunately, or fortunately. Let's get after it. We got a poll somewhere. Let's touch that because I can go for an hour and go, shit, I never said anything with the poll. So is the entire nuclear industry just one big stupid genocidal human and species hating criminal empire? So I have 100 caricatures that I could use. And this was more of a thought, right? I was getting, because now I had changed gears at supper time after working all day on the 24-hour news cycle. We'll get to that one next week, another pile of shows. So tonight you got lots of pictures, the original pictures, TEPCO's original 1900 pictures. We're going to fish, well, not going to, we fished through those 1900 pictures. And I haven't got everything, but I got a lot, probably too much. So this story is March the 15th, March the 16th. So this is after all the reactors had detonated. This is day 6 after the tsunami. Fast facts about radiation from the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear reactor. So this is day 6. And they're already like, nothing to see here, move along. If not, here's some fast facts about radiation when you have multiple nuclear reactors melting down. And this had just blown up the day before Reactor 3. It was a mixed oxide fuel with decades of reactor cores and fuel pools. I'm not going to make any promises, but we're going to try to run right through this. Everybody's laughing at me out there right now, I'm sure. We're going to try to just run right through it without too many fast facts. The Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster, home to 6 nuclear reactors, well, not anymore, but had witnessed explosions at 3 reactors. It was 4 reactors that detonated. Now, this is on the 16th, so there's 4. And a fire in the spent fuel pool at Reactor 4, at what they say a 4th. Okay, let's keep going. Had witnessed explosions at 3 reactors. No, I mean, who knows? A big tsunami, 1,300 miles of the coastline, got yanked off the coast. There's no telephone poles, there's no electricity, there's total pandemonium. Highways are blocked up, people are sheltering the place. The world is literally falling apart for Japan, and our heart went out to them. At 2 reactors, Unit 2 and 3, the vessels containing nuclear material, no one knew how to talk the first week, right, are suspected to be compromised. That's Reactor 1, so that had, or 2, that had detonated and caught fire and liquefied. Now we know in retrospect, right? But Reactor 3 actually looked like that when they put out the story, so don't forget that. In other words, it's gone. The fuel pools are gone. The reactor cores are ejected right out of the building. There's only a stump left. A handful of plant workers remained on site, implementing emergency cooling measures. Implementing emergency cooling measures. Because anybody's in the know is like, holy shit, what are you talking about? Implementing overheating reactors. This is day 6, so it just looked like that. So you can't get near a reactor 2 or reactor 1 or reactor 4 on the other side of it, even if they didn't melt down, because that has tossed fuel assemblies everywhere. They felt the explosion of this one, by the way, 25 miles away. And I think that headline, no, it's not there tonight. A handful of plant workers remained on site implementing emergency cooling measures at the stricken overheating reactors. I was just laughing to myself because I've been doing this for so long, for over a decade. I'm pounding Fukushima, a narrative out there. And I'm not allowed, as it is, I'm under a lot of scrutiny. I'm not allowed to make a mistake, not even a Freudian slip. Everything I says has to be accurate. I'm not able, and there's no need, of course, to misrepresent anything, because how can you tell a story by doing that, right? And even worse, because I'm providing the documentation constantly. So the people that are following this stuff are extremely astute at this topic. Nobody, and I mean nobody, is going to hoodwink those people. And it carries over to many facets of your life in reality, right? Emergency cooling measures at the stricken overheating reactors that's reactor to stump of reactors 3 and 4. Now, these are the original pictures you see in the night from that first couple of weeks. So I can see, look at the 7,000 people at work. Look at that, in their paper suits. Mom, Dana's hallucinating. Radiation levels have fluctuated wildly during the crisis, and the extent which the world's workers' health has been endangered may not become apparent for years or minutes. But so far, the radiation releases has been limited compared with the Chernobyl. Dirty bastards, eh? Yeah, that looks like it's limited to nobody that looks at the picture, right? So that's the original pictures. If you try to walk through that plume, you cannot come out the other side. You'll die immediately. Well, you can't get near it because of the neutron bombardment, the gamma shines, the X-rays, the beta rays. They'll melt your organs in a few moments. Radiation levels have fluctuated widely. These people don't know any better, so ignore that part of it. But we're doing retrospect, right, for the first month of Fukushima, to which the workers' health has been endangered, may not become apparent for years. And the reality of it is you're in such a high-dosed area, it'll appear in minutes. And that's why they're running out of homeless, right? So far, the radiation release has been limited compared with Chernobyl in Ukraine, which is absolutely absurd lie. An explosive event that caused dozens of cases of fatal radiation poisoning among the plant workers. There's 865,000 extra cancers in Japan in the first year, according to the cancer I said it. I got to bring it up now, otherwise I'm a lawyer. Hang on, it only takes a second, fortunately, to sometimes. 865,000 cancers in the first year via the Japan's National Cancer Center. So these are the original footage pictures. Tsunami ran through the site in 1,300 miles of the coastline. As many nuclear experts have noted, the Fukushima reactors are better designed than the failed Chernobyl. Well, Chernobyl didn't have a tsunami hit it at 600 miles per hour and crush everything, right? Below are some facts and figures about the radiation hazard posed by the Fukushima breakdown, however, compared with other nuclear accidents. There's a lot of those types of stories now that I think about it. Many of the figures are measured in millisieverts, which is physical particles of the fuel rods pulsing X-rays and gamma shines and neutron bursts and beta rays. These are lethal doses we're talking about, which international units. So, and second off, it's plumes, physical plumes of particulates and atoms, and these are just vicious. This material is 2 billion times more toxic than industrial poison of the same quantity. Many of the figures are measured in millisieverts, international unit of radiation doses. 1 sievert is equal to 100 rems, which is the dose unit of X-rays and gamma rays. Now, out in front of Unit 1 was over 1 million sieverts. So as soon as you get to 3 sieverts, you're talking about lethal doses. So ignore what they're trying to tell you, right? So this is right away, this is what it looked like at the pumping station, which was disabled immediately. You need a lot of water to cool down. You can't just shut them down. You've got to go through a long process to shut these things down, right? And it needs a lot of water, 1 million gallons a minute. A radiation dose at the boundary of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power station on March the 16th, 1.9 millisieverts. This is an insult to the victims that sacrificed it all at ground zero. It's a 100% insult. They're spraying, and these people are committing suicide. They're there to spray symbolically the stump of Reactor 3, right? Peak dose is measured inside the Daiichi on the 15th, when Reactor 3 actually exploded. This Medusa right there was 6.2 millisieverts, which is irrelevant when you compare it to the actual doses. It's a despicable thing to say, but I mean, this was the propaganda machine in full swing, but it was pretty despicable, I think, pretty dishonest. And to go that low, it's like running your child over and telling them, well, I seen your child, they got a little cut on their finger, see you later. And it turns out you ran the child over and all their bones are broken and they're going to die that day. That's the equivalent of writing this type of story. Estimates total exposure to the boundary of the 3 Mile Island site, Pennsylvania, in 1979, 1 millisievert or less. That's a pretty dishonest thing to say, because there was enormous increases in cancer and infant mortality rates had doubled. Birds had disappeared. There was pets dying that were left behind. The list is very long. We've done entire presentations on this. And you can look at a huge one I'd done when Netflix put out Chernobyl. I put out a response to Netflix didn't tell you about Chernobyl video. And make you rethink nuclear forever. That's the end of any nuclear fantasies anybody's going to have if they watch that. Average total radiation dose to 115,000 individuals after Chernobyl, 31 millisieverts. You know, they actually closed 9,000 farms. It was 9,400 plus farms in Ireland, Scotland, and United Kingdom after Chernobyl, because it's the nuclear wasteland. They should have evacuated Ireland, Scotland, and United Kingdom, because radiation doesn't just look for farms. And this first part will help you comprehend better the rest of the story, where I didn't provide so much documentation. Half-life of iodine-131, a dangerous radioactive isotope released in nuclear accidents, which is another insult, by the way, 8 days, which is a completely disingenuous and dishonest thing to do. And this is what you'll see symmetrically throughout your universities and media. They'll come out with that particular narrative. And it's true, there's a vicious dose, though, and it's true. There's going to be 10 times more iodine-132, 30 times more iodine-133, 31 times more iodine-129. For every iodine-131 produced, 132 and 133 iodines are 10 times more effective at ionizing and radiating the thyroid glands of birds and mammals and animals and insects and humans than brutally effective 131 is. It's true, but the problem is the reactors are, all these isotopes and daughters are produced from uranium. Everything you're seeing is a All of these acronyms up there ends up as a name with a bunch of daughters. The reactors run on uranium, plutonium, right? And you have all their nasty daughters. And it's so dishonest to say iodine 131. Sometimes I have to come out and with a rebuttal that makes sure there's no one living in illusions. It's just only a fraction of what actually is out there, right? And they're talking about iodine 131. It was pretty dishonest and pretty disappointing, and that's how they live their life. And they go on with their life like they're big shots and they're important, and they just turn their back on humanity and the 8 million species and with a pen. My dad used to say the serial killer that scares him is not the guy with the knife in his hand or the gun, it's the guy with a pen. That's the serial killers that worries him. And I have to agree, it worries me too. Nuclear experts, so this is March the 12th. This is the day after the tsunami. Reactor 1 has melted down. It started melting down 50 minutes after the high-speed tsunami hit that coastline repeatedly, I might add. Nuclear experts are playing worst-case scenario at Fukushima nuclear power plant by Steve Mitski on March the 12th. So nobody knows. You just had a tsunami tear the country apart, massive earthquake. Most people had no concept Fukushima was happening, right? I'm not saying that. I'm just saying retrospectively, the people in the know who wrote these articles read them because they knew what was happening and they wanted to downplay it. First came the earthquake centered off Japan's coastline and then added the horror of a tsunami. The world waits as an emergency crews attempt to stop a core meltdown from occurring at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear reactor. There was 15 reactors in that zone that went station blackout, which means they lost all power. Already the site of an explosion on the reactor housing structure. Now they're talking about Reactor 1. And this was the fuel pool. It was a meltdown. That's what causes the explosions, actual meltdowns. The cladding, which is just outside the tube at the high enough temperatures interact with the water, it's essentially a high-speed rusting where the zirconium claddings, so that the tubes are covered with this zirconium cladding. They used to use it in cameras for flash back in the 40s and 50s, which was brutal, man. Dirty buggers, eh? Setting off these dirty bombs every time you took a picture. And hydrogen at the right concentration in an atmosphere is either flammable or explosive. This happened a couple of days later than this story, by the way. But remember, we're doing retrospectively. Worst case scenario, venting in order to keep the containment vessel from failing. Well, you can't vent. Right, you can't vent when the place is torn apart. And there's 1,300 miles of coastline had just eaten a 500-600 mile multiple waves and ripped out part of the country. The story we'll tell you later. I always say 480 miles. It was actually 1,300 miles of the coastline. Worst case scenario, they're venting in order to keep the containment vessel from failing, but you couldn't vent because you had ripped out the whole coastline, all the infrastructure, all the power. There was no power to vent. And once you had the first detonation, you couldn't get near the other reactors or the control rooms to, even if you did have power, which they didn't, right? It was slow, and I mean, we're talking a substantial amount of water ran through that site. It will slump to the bottom of the reactor vessel, melt through the reactor vessel onto the containment floor. It's likely to spread as a molten pool, like lava to the edge of the steel shell and melt through that. That would result in a containment fail in a matter of less than a day. Well, it's so hot, it's burning at 9,000 degree Fahrenheit temperatures. It's going to go through there in about 6 minutes. It's just like proverbial hot knife goes through butter. He was the winner of a twist contest in 1962 for which he received 3 crayons and 3 pieces of construction paper. And it remains his most prestigious and only award, I'm sure. So they write these little stories of propagandas, and that pays their mortgage. It pays for their children's music teachers and private schools, and pays for their fancy cars and swimming pools and cocktail parties. And all you got to do is sell everybody out. That's what a journalist actually is. You couldn't get back into the control room for 7 years, by the way. Think about that later. How far from Fukushima will the fallout pose? And you know what I mean, right? Where they were venting when there's no power, and you can't beat her because it's a nuclear wasteland. And you can see it in that particular picture from TEPCO. These are the original pictures, and you're going to see a bunch of them. How far from Fukushima will fallout pose a health risk? So this is March the 18th. So now we got detonations, and we got the time for the plumes to reach the northern hemisphere. And the plumes look like that. That's 27 days. So March the 18th, you can see the plume up in the top, the very top one. That's the same day that article is written, March the 18th. So look at the plume for March the 18th up there. Covers all of the coastline of the northern hemisphere almost. Within less than 20 days, March 25th, 14 days, 2 weeks, the planet's pretty well covered in radioactive fallout. And by 26 days later, then the entire planet is a thick plume. Now, these models are based on venting. This is not a venting. And they even say earlier, well, there was no ejection of the radioactive material into the environment, therefore there can't be any plume, right? As you'll see coming up. People in the U.S. will not face any danger, but people did face the danger, and there's the proof of it. We got an absurd amount of proof of it. We've covered forever this story 5 days a week when we can. Japanese authorities have carved out the area around Fukushima into 2 zones, recommending individuals within 20 kilometers of the plant evacuate, and anybody else from 20 to 30 should take shelter and stay put. So if the people inside have to evacuate out past that, then the people at 20 and 30 should evacuate too. Like, it doesn't make any sense to leave them home. The other people are evacuating out because you got to breathe air. Took the dramatic steps March the 16th, recommending the Americans within 50 miles, 80 kilometers, the Fukushima Daiichi evacuate the area. And they're a right to do it too, obviously, right? This is the original pictures. That's Reactor 3 and the stumps of Reactor 3 and 4. This was a suicide squad they sent in to pump water on Reactor 3 in a completely pointless to sacrifice their lives to do it because the water had no effect whatsoever. It's already blown sky high and ejected the fuel pools. This is symbolic so they get pictures to pretend to the world that they got it under control. That's the only reason that picture existed. And these people were so radioactive they couldn't stand close to each other because of the radiation they were creating. Because the emissions from like the particles and the physical atoms and that you breathe in or drink or eat, those types of physical atoms, not the gamma shines, the X-rays, the neutron bombardments, the beta rays, from energy, which will melt your organs. The physical particulates and atoms and isotopes, the gammas, alphas, neutrons, and betas don't mix. So when they hit each other, they change direction. The problem with it is they're traveling almost at the speed of light. So at that speed, you create X-rays, full-body X-rays. And that's what we see happening throughout our forests worldwide now because of the radioactive fallout. This incredible, been going on since the nuclear wars they called disguised as testing. It's the same bombs, the same radioactive fallout, right? And so millisieverts And the U.S. guidelines, millisieverts, you're not going to get the X-rays and gamma shines and neutron bombardments and beta rays, 5,500 miles away. That's physical radioactive particles falling out. They pulse energy every second, almost the speed of light, long past the human experience, and they never go away. So we got 80 years of the bioaccumulation. We're in real trouble. It's disguised, the problems that it's causing is disguised as carbon. But carbon emissions only go 50 to 100 miles, and they don't pulse energy every second. And you can't have plants or trees or animals or biota without carbon, which would bear the brunt of radioactive fallout from a nuclear accident extending 60 kilometers in each direction. Of course, as we know now, retrospectively, right? And they knew then because that was on March the 18th. All the reactors had detonated. Medusa, reactor 3, was detonated. And this was a nasty one because this was the mixed oxide fuel reactor. This was the mixed oxide fuel reactor. We got a poll. Might as well bring that up. Is the entire nuclear industry just one big, stupid, genocidal, human and species-hating criminal empire? Yeah. Show me the evidence different, right? Show me different. Show me it's not. It can't be done. I can beat you on any argument in the industry. Give me your best scientists, your best physicists, I can beat them. All I got to do is tell the truth. They're not allowed. I am. There's no way they can beat me. Life-threatening doses generally not occur outside the zone, which is nonsense. It's 100%. Researchers were too frightened to get closer than 100 kilometers. Immediate, and this is one of the ways it's not going to hurt you immediately, right? So don't worry about it. What do you mean by that, though? Wait a second, hang on. The material in the plume, as it undergoes radioactive decay, gives off dangerous radiation, primarily in the form of gamma rays and whole body X-rays, and can pose additional hazards if inhaled, swallowed, absorbed through the skin. Think about that statement. To emit radiation from inside the body. Brushberg, a health and medical physicist at the University of California, Davis, if there's a plume that passes overhead, then there's a whole body X-rays on top of that. Some of the material participated down, you may be externally contaminated. Externally. Well, when you're picking up 30 million one-ton bags, it's impossible not to breathe in and inhale it. Let's put it that way. Or all the water has to be contaminated. You can't. Everything you touch has to be radioactive fallout. You can't escape it. And they're growing food right alongside the one-ton bags in the no-go zone, surrounded by a nuclear wasteland, where the food is banned in 14 prefectures by 55 countries for over a decade. It don't even make any sense. How is this even possible? Unless, the only way it can make any sense is if the entire nuclear industry is just one big stupid, genocidal, demonic, sadistic, human and species-hating criminal empire. Then it makes sense. Perfect sense if that's what's going on. So that's the only thing that makes sense. And, prove me wrong. So they're growing food in the greenhouses, and they got millions, or in that case, there are tens of thousands of one-ton bags of radiation. Shelter-in-place recommendation made by the Jap authorities for individuals between 20 and 30 kilometers from Fukushima Daiichi is intended to minimize ingestion of radioactive material and prevent skin and clothing from becoming contaminated as the plume deposits radionuclides around the area. But your water is contaminated right away. The air has to come into your house somewhere. Try keeping your pets in the house during all of this too. The list goes on and on. It's just they should have been evacuated. You can't shelter in your place. You can't stay there. It's going to be infinitely worse than taking off, unfortunately. But they didn't want to tell you which way the plume was traveling. And they had a speedy system that made 5,500 computer models of radioactive fallout over the first 30 days, but they wouldn't give it out to the population. They wouldn't even acknowledge it. They gave it to the American government, the military though. Government sessions reveal 400,000 times xenon-133 levels in Chiba, which is right alongside of Tokyo. So in order to make it to 200 kilometers to Chiba, you should have evacuated all 200 kilometers. Do you get it? Well, if you don't, now you do. If you don't know, now you do, right? So you got, every time you see the green tarps, that's 1-ton bags of radiation stacked up. Right, so that's what it looks like under the tarp, or like that. So far, the precautions seem to be sufficient. Those are appropriate actions to take to keep the dose to the population below 1 rem. Well, you couldn't keep it below 1 rem and pick up 30 million 1-ton bags later. So obviously that didn't pan out, and they knew it. So where's the cliche? Well, they're going to mention Richard Vedder. Terrible human, we now know. So far, and I'll show you, I'll actually got him in an interview coming up in a minute. So far, those precautions seem to be sufficient. Those are appropriate actions to take to keep the dose of the population below 1 rem or 10 millisieverts. So 10 millisieverts equal to 1 rem. Says Richard the Monster Vedder, a professor emeritus of biophysics at the Mayo Clinic. Think about that statement, at the Mayo Clinic. He's a terrible human, by the way, as you'll see. If the actions are taken, the doses are in fact lower than 1 rem, they will experience no health effect. Problem is, if you get a single atom in your body attacks with white blood cells for the rest of your life, and eventually after decades will build a tumor around it. But if you're in a nuclear wasteland and you're drinking it, eating it, breathing it constantly, your bioaccumulation is through the roof. It has to attack every single atom for the rest of your life with white blood cells 24 hours a day. And for every white blood cell is 1 less red blood cell. So eventually you got so many white blood cells, that's called leukemia. That don't take very long. So there's 1,800 diseases besides cancer. And they only like to mention cancers. So the Japan Broadcasting Company reported March the 17th, that was the day before this story, measurements registered radiation levels of 0.17 millisieverts per hour at one location 30 kilometers northwest of the site. Of course, this is an absurd assertion when you look at the evidence after. And people like Vedder, Richard Vedder, would have known that. And you don't measure it in millisieverts. These bags are not millisieverts. They're 100,000 becquerels a kilogram, which are extraordinary numbers, I might like to add. Those levels were abnormally high at most other locations. The levels were roughly 1%, 10%. And would have persisted for 60 hours to deliver 10 millisieverts, which is a horrific misrepresentation of the facts. In fact, the radioactive rain caused 130 schools in South Korea to close from Fukushima. But Richard Vedder, as you can see him there, and we got a video of him. I'll just play that little clip of Richard. He's sitting with a whole bunch of goblins. You got Kathleen Higley directly to his right, and they even got Miles O'Brien, and we'll just play it out. Hang on.
There's probably someone on the panel foolish enough to address that question, but
now, how did everybody know to laugh? That's the first question I want you to ask yourself. How did the audience, which was journalists, know to laugh? And that all the people that were on the stage, like we've called each one of them out individually many times over the year. Some of them are just ridiculous. Unfortunately, we're not going to cover it tonight.
There's probably someone on the panel foolish enough to address that question, but we are radiation safety professionals,
That's not
and
Richard.
licensing of
Hang on.
nuclear power plants is really kind of out of our scope. I'm going to ask Dr. Vetter to talk briefly here. You haven't had an opportunity. I know you're an expert in dosimetry.
So they were asking a question about radioactive fallout. I forgot to give you the prime. Now they're going to ask Richard Vetter, which is Kathleen Higley is in the center. She's a horrific monster, pro-nuclear scum we've covered at least 100 times.
In measurements. So,
Well, the reason I haven't had an opportunity to talk is because there are no problems in the medical field.
So how did everybody know to laugh again? Because these are despicable lies. These are horrific lies. And everybody knew to laugh right on cue. A normal audience would never got that kind of a joke. Because that's a sick joke. That's like, ho, 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 you one twisted, sick monster, buddy. In a court of law, they probably would have got contempt of court for saying that. Fukushima, by the way, is the most serious man-made disaster in human history. Obesity rates after a nuclear accident, excessive weight gain, is a marker of radiation brain damage, and Japan almost doubled in the first year. Remember, there's 865,000 cancers. Cancer is just one of 1,800 diseases, and not everybody had health care, not everybody was diagnosed. So 865,000 extra cancers compared to any other year, an abnormality, a spike, is what the hell is going on here. It's unbelievably statistically important. Fukushima children not growing in weight, and the average increases are down 75%. Some children only gained 1 pound in a year. So he makes a living preying on these victims, right? Data showed a large spike in Idaho deaths, particularly infant deaths, the 14 weeks following Fukushima. And did you hear all these people laughing? Because they knew what was going to happen. These are not naive. These are not gullible. They were laughing about it. They knew that was going to show up. They didn't know anybody was going to do a study, but they knew that the children would be dying all over America from it. Over 30,000 square kilometers in Japan exceed levels of 10,000 becquerels a square meter. So to suggest there was going to be no adverse side effects, you can lose. That's the quickest way to lose faith in humanity, is when you see people like that say the things like he just said, and the people that laughed. All those people that laughed is unbelievable. It's unbelievable that all of those, and I covered every one of them people multiple times. Let's keep it rolling. A health physicist at Brookhaven National Laboratories in New Jersey, which is surrounded by cancer clusters. And there's many people at the Brookhaven National Laboratory that have lifetime disability from Brookhaven because they have debilitating cancers and diseases. There's actually 1,800 diseases. So whenever you hear, and most people who don't know any better, have never seen anything like these types of programs, will only think cancer because that's all they're ever going to hear about, right? But Alzheimer's, dementia, autism, diabetes, Down syndrome, schizophrenia are typical after major nuclear events. We've had thousands of them. Evacuation is not always the best, because when you put in the context of all the dumping and all the nuclear bombs they set off, these were nuclear wars. Evacuation is not always the best way to avoid a radiation dose. Sheltering in place is a very effective form of protection, but it's not. You got to leave at some point, and now when you're going out, you're in a nuclear wasteland. But at least when you leave, and you're still going to have the nuclear wasteland, but you're going to get ahead of it. Staying there, breathing the air for what they want, 2 weeks to stay, and so they wouldn't get a bad reputation is all that was all about. This is 2 weeks after. They're not working on the reactors. They're down by the ocean as far away from the reactors they can get, trying to identify certain areas. These were pictures, the original pictures. Workers battle Fukushima nuclear crisis at personal risk. Workers, not nuclear scientists or nuclear academics or nuclear corporations, but workers. This is March the 16th. This is the last day of detonations. Braving explosions and invisible hydrogen fires, as well as bursts of radiation at 8 times higher than the government's hourly safety standards. The exhaust stacks, which are quite a ways away from the reactors, were at lethal doses of 10 sieverts an hour, for goodness sakes. The reactors, like Reactor 3, ejected the reactor core and the fuel pool all over the site. These are lethal doses everywhere. So to suggest that they're 8 times the standard acceptable dose, I have a hard time accepting people are that evil, but after all these years, I still have not a hard time accepting it because you got no choice when faced with it overwhelmingly every day. But I still have a hard time understanding how there's that many evil people that would say something like that, which is why you got that poll tonight. Is the entire nuclear industry just one big stupid, maniac, genocidal, monstrous, human and species-hating criminal empire? Well, obviously that's what's going on. You have to have your head pretty far down in the bucket of sand not to know that difference on that one. The workers represent the last line of defense in cooling the overheated reactors and spent fuel pools. The workers, you know, the homeless, and the destitute, and the victims of society, and the immigrants who don't speak the language, such as reactor number 3, which we affectionately called Medusa, which is still billowing white smoke or steam, a possible indication of a breach in the thick steel and cement. Possible breach. That the containment of the nuclear core to water boiling off a spent fuel pool. Let's look at that picture again, because one of us is missing something. Hang on, because this caused some pretty drastic... Here we go. There we go. So reactor 3, Dana, to your left. I can't do nothing left. Hang on. So reactor 3 is this building right here. Hang on. Dana, need your big head for a minute. Roger that. That's what it looked like when they wrote the story that day. That's what it looked like. And so their job on that day was to cover that up. So they get a paycheck and pay their mortgage and their children's dental and get their parents a nice swimming pool for their anniversary. And all you do is sell out all the other humans and all the animals and birds on the planet. And the world is your oyster. So this is the next day. There is nothing left. The fuel pools, reactor cores at the top of the building. What you're looking at there, it turned out, was that, and reactor 4, the same thing, to your left. To your left, Dana, right there. So there, like, what you see that, what you're looking at there, that red thing is a cement pump truck that they got water hooked up to. And they're allegedly spraying water into the fuel pool. But this is a 190-foot building, and there is no fuel pool. There's no top to the pool, or to the building. That had detonated. Not maybe, not almost. We know that's gone. Because you got to realize how, like, that's 150 feet wide. It's okay, we'll get out of that. Back to the madness. The madness, what have we got done now? There we go. Don't stop, Dan. You got to keep going. Has evacuated all non-essential personnel due to radiation pulses spiking as high as 400 millisieverts. It turns out to be, it was hundreds of sieverts. Not going to evacuate them for 400. The melted fuel from reactor 3 is the highly lethal mixed uranium plutonium oxide, also known as MOX fuel. It's last to be attempt to fuel removal. Now, they actually claimed they got the fuel out of the pool that no longer exists last year. It's a pretty neat trick. And reading at the border of the power plant site of roughly 6 millisieverts per hour, you had multiple reactors had detonated before the 16th, right? Which is when this story came out. So then, like, the reason you can't know all these little details without knowing actually what I just showed you, see? Like, because that information was available to them. Their job, which is the nuclear industry wrote the story, they put their name on it. Almost all major nuclear stories will be written by the industry, the lobbying group, sent to the media. Media puts some journalist's name. That's how they make so much money. It's just useful idiots. But in this case, they're mass murderers, genocidal maniacs. Enough for an individual worker to reach the maximum exposure allowed by the standard Japan regulation for a full year in less than 9 hours. It was 514 sieverts. You walk past that, your organs melt right away and you drop dead like you got shot with a sniper round. Like, that site was a lethal dose. And there is pictures of people there. We got some of them coming up from the original pictures where they're in paper suits. You cannot protect someone in a paper suit. In fact, the Japanese Health Ministries raised the legal limit on radiation exposure to 250 millisieverts a year, which is not going to help. 5 times the standard level, which is also the legal limit in the U.S., to enable the 50 or so workers. This is the fable, the 50. The Fukushima 50 is a total fable. And so workers, and I'll show you what I mean by that, because the big picture, you got to remember the big picture. Remember, this is on the 16th, but they're framing the narrative. And the only people that are going to do something like that is going to be the regulatory and the nuclear lobbying, right? The journalists are not going to do it on their own. This is the nuclear lobbying groups that are doing it, writing the stories. And I can't show you the documentation for everything, even though I usually do, because it's just too much work. Don't make me feel guilty doing all the work. So 16,000 workers quit. No, Dana, there was 50. Fukushima 50, Dana. There's 16,000 quit. Unit 1 and 2 exhaust stacks were at 10 sieverts an hour. You couldn't get near the disease factories. They're working down by the shoreline, not by the reactors. Most of the pictures that were released, there was they sent in some of the homeless to get pictures. And then say, we'll send you a check at the end of the week for $3,000, but they would have died before the end of the week. These workers continue to struggle to cool overheating nuclear. I mean, this is what they've done, right? I'm not a joke. Workers continue to struggle to cool overheating nuclear reactors by pumping seawater through fire extinguishing system lines. They weren't pumping water through nothing. It's absurd to suggest they're pumping water on the 16th. There's an employee in a paper suit, and he's leaned over, and which is implying that's a hot piece of fuel pellet that is left there. If he was an academic, he would have ran the minute he seen the Geiger counter. Never looked back. He said, keep the money, I'm never coming back. If there is a shielding material between you and the radiation source, the radiation dose is reduced. Well, there's no shielding. So they're suggesting they're naturally shielding because you need a 4-foot thick lead suit to work in that environment. Do you get it? would take cumbersome lead suits or the like to block more energetic radiation, but everything at a nuclear meltdown isn't energetic radiation. Most familiar, which are known as X-rays and gamma rays. No, which are the most familiar, but the neutron bombardment is the worst. Gammas, alphas, betas, neutrons in these quantities are lethal doses. Detecting 100,000 sieverts. So walking past 3 sieverts is a lethal dose. I'll play that video for you in a minute from Harvard University in about 60 seconds. Typical workers are likely relying on either shielding themselves behind of equipment I can't see anymore. So all equipment involved in power generation, the boiling water reactor like those at Fukushima is radioactive to some extent, or limiting the time spent receiving radiation doses. They're shielding themselves behind other equipment. Hey, Georgie, come over here. Get in front of me. Run over, turn the valve. See you, George. I'll tell you, your wife, you loved her. And run away. These are lunatics, right? The assemblies were thrown all over the site. You had a tsunami rip the site apart. Then the reactors detonated through fuel assemblies with like 100 fuel rods in each assembly. The fuel rods are 12 feet long and 18 pounds each. And they're full of pellets in each rod of uranium, plutonium, not iodine. Even those TEPCO workers received significant doses of radiation, more than 2 sieverts, are high enough to cause immediate radiation sickness characterized by skin redness, and hair loss, nausea, and even burns could be treated with drugs, which is one, like they're talking about Peruvian blue and stuff like that. You can't treat this kind of dose because you're melting organs. There's no way to treat it because you melt all the everything. You melt, not just, you'll liquefy the organs and you'll excrete them 5 minutes later as you're dying, like they did at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Yeah, it looks like a perfectly normal site to me, too. I want you to go over there so I can get a picture. Now, the fuel assemblies were popped all over this place. If you're going in there, you're dying right away. Remember, there's 1,800 diseases, not just cancer. 1,800 diseases. So here's 2 clips of Harvard University. Let me do the poll first. Is the entire batshit lunatic nuclear industry just one big stupid mass murder and genocidal human and species hating criminal empire? Yeah, of course it is. We thank everybody for participating in it. So let's play these 2 clips. They're going to explain to you the doses at Fukushima.
And in the US context, we think of REM, and I assume in the Japanese context, people would think of sievert. The fatal dose from whole body exposure, median dose is around 350, 400 REM, or 3.5 to 4 sievert.
Delivered pretty quickly.
Delivered over a period of hours, but in that case, death would follow over subsequent weeks. But that gives you an indication of the sort of hazard that you're concerned. So a few sieverts, if the dose looks as though it'll be more than 2 or 3 sieverts over a period of plume passage, for example, then you know that you're in a potentially lethal situation. Whereas speaking in microsieverts is not helpful.
Now remember the guy in the end there from the last video of Richard a couple of years later, 5 years later or something? So he's talking about a plume passage in the community of multiple sieverts. In fact, they actually talk about 10 sieverts. So the most commonly accepted value for risk is that increased risk of cancer is 4% per sievert, 4% per sievert. So he's saying if they get 3 sieverts in the story, the nuclear lobbyists who gave that to the media to publish, to deceive you, is claiming it's 4% cancer and don't think about nothing else, when 3 sieverts is a lethal dose. In context, that you're in a nuclear wasteland where fuel pools and reactor cores are detonating all around you. This is unprecedented in human history. We got nothing else to compare it to. There's no comparison to Fukushima. Fukushima is right out there on its own. You got Chernobyl with a meltdown, 3 Mile Island with a meltdown, and Sellafield with a meltdown, and Santa Susana with a meltdown. You got Fukushima with reactors, with decades of reactor fuels at the top of the buildings, blowing up and catching fire and blowing up. Cesium with a half-life of 30 years, meaning it'll take 3 decades for it to lose half its radiation punch. You know, when you hear half-life, it's not like all of it decays. They say 50%. So some cesium-137 takes 300 years to decay before it changes to another isotope, right? It's not like it all changes every 30 years. And this is a mathematical equation. They can't quantify because you don't have 300-year history to back it up, right? And the minute you try to believe anything the nuclear industry tells you is the minute you're in real trouble. Is you'll never make any sense of anything. Partial meltdowns have cracked as much as 70% of the fuel rods number 1. The fuel rods in reactor number 1 it melted down right away and detonated, but it melted down within 50 minutes, we know now. And whoever wrote that story would have known that too. That's reactor 1 he's pointing to in his paper suit. Like, you can't be shielded from gamma shines right there. Gamma has no problem banging you from right there with huge neutron bombardments and everything else. Think about number 1 was one study in 2011, a couple of months later, showed 266 sieverts. Remember what Harvard said about 3 sieverts from a radioactive plume passing over your community? Think about being right alongside a Medusa. And the fuel rods number 3 were exposed to the air for hours. Well, here's reactor 3. Do you think that it stopped being exposed after a few hours? Does anybody really think that the fuel rods are there? As the end of the day of March the 16th, because this is still on March the 16th, according to the Japan's Atomic Industry Forum, fuel rods remain exposed in all 3 reactors. But yeah, they're not exposed in that reactor 3 because they're ejected out of the reactor. The fuel pools with decades of reactor cores was ejected from the top of the building. The reactor core was ejected right out of the building. The reactor core is nowhere to be seen. It's supposed to be at the top of the building. So whoever wrote that story had to be unbelievably educated in the topic, and so they would have been in the know. Workers continue to pump seawater into all of them to prevent any further melting. Does it look like anybody's pumping seawater into these buildings to further melting? I can't further melt down what happened right there. Like if they were going to pump water in, they needed to do it immediately, not weeks and weeks later, which is what you're seeing happening, right? These are remote control. They're trying to put a pad there to put in a pump truck to symbolically pretend they got control of the situation. But the reactor core is gone, and so is the fuel pools in reactor 4. They were changing the fuel, so the reactor had at least half of the reactor core still in it, if not more. Venting radioactive steam and gases is necessary to ensure that no further cracks develop. Do you think they're venting? You think somebody's in a control room venting radiation from the reactor in that building? Is there anybody out there actually that gullible? 'Cause I mean, you got 2 reactors. One of them's 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 got 2 reactors. One of Really? Is there? No, Dana, get on with it. Thank goodness. Venting radioactive steam. Venting radioactive steam. Kooky. You can't get much kookier than that. Just trying to fix something that didn't work out too good. Keep it rolling. Venting radioactive steam and gases as necessary. Look, you couldn't get close enough to vent anything. See all these steel plates? They brought them in with remote control cranes and backhoes and bulldozers and lined them up. Anybody that goes in there is going to die that day, that hour. You're not venting. You're not venting. And the spent fuel pools reactor 3 and 4 have lost water, potentially exposing those still hot nuclear fuel rods. Well, there's 3 and there's 4. They're not working on them. They're not venting them. They're not putting water into them. And you see the reactors? You can see some smoke up there in the top corner. See those tall, skinny stacks? They use them for venting the fuel pools into all the farms that these are usually surrounded by. The fuel pools are hot because they're splitting atoms. The atoms are piped up as steam because they ball off about 120,000 liters at all fuel pools worldwide each day. Each liter is going to be trillions of atoms, anthropogenic man-made hot particles. Curium is the biggest byproduct of radiated fuel rod, and you need lead shielding 20 times thicker for curium than you do for plutonium. Plutonium is lethal. Why? Fukushima Daiichi won't be another Chernobyl new scientist. To show you 1986, it's not 1986 again. I don't know, it kind of looks like 1986 to me. That's Fukushima, that's Chernobyl. Chernobyl, brand new reactor. Fukushima, 40 years old each. Way bigger, more deadly fuel. 4 decades of reactor cores stored at the top of the buildings because we don't have a repository anywhere on the planet, let alone Japan. Explosions damaging both the outer buildings and part of the containment system tend to prevent radioactive material from escaping. Because of these breaches, some of the material has gotten to the atmosphere. Unit 2, by the way, completely liquefied. It's 100% liquefaction of the uranium core. Never seen anything like it in the history of nuclear power. Additionally, the ponds, and they use the word ponds because when you hear about ponds, we think happy, right? Swimming, fishing, hanging out with friends and everything else, right? Playing frisbees, showing, kicking soccer balls, whatever. But these are not ponds. It's absurd to call these things ponds. You don't swim in these ponds. That's a lethal dose. And so think about all this media is just a fraction of the world's media, pretending they're in the fuel ponds, aka pools, at the very top of the building that no longer exists. That's the stump of the ghost of Reactor 4 right there. And they're all pretending they're in Reactor 4. So retrospective, when you look back on it, it's scary that there's people out there who would write stories like this. And you can't write stories like this unless you're really switched on to nuclear. You got to be, this is high-level stuff. And so the media that put their name on these stories originally, you know, they should be held accountable. We should get up a big list of them, and we should call for their prosecution for trying to exterminate us. The Japanese authorities provisionally put the event at a level 4. At a level 4. That's level 7, which is the highest level it gets any day of the week, right? They delayed raising it to level 7 because they didn't want to cause a panic, he says later. The French crazies rated disasters a level 5 and 6, but both Reactor 3 and Reactor 4 are stumps. There is no reactors left. There is no fuel pools left. That's A reactor fuel pool is a level 7. A reactor running reactor core is a level, oh my goodness. So why couldn't a runaway reactor happen at Fukushima? Wait a second, that's exactly what happened. And at the time, when they writ that story on the 16th, they knew this had happened. You couldn't have that position be writing those stories unless you knew what happened. They're saying Chernobyl had a fundamentally different design to those at Fukushima Daiichi. Chernobyl ran on enriched uranium. Fukushima Daiichi runs on more powerful fuel than Chernobyl, mostly enriched uranium. So why make that statement? It was meant to confuse you. This is original footage down by the seaside, by the pump houses. Just show you how much disarray was going on is all I'm trying to do. Could Fukushima Daiichi catch fire like Chernobyl? I mean, this is the 16th. When the reactors actually looked like that on the 16th. That's just 2 of them, by the way, right? So this was 2.5, 3 weeks later. They had the pump truck there, long after everything was melted. That was there to manipulate you into thinking that the fuel pools were intact. Right? Because they weren't broadcasting this originally. These pictures were released later. And I got entire presentations in all 1,900 of those pictures trying to explain each picture. We went through every single picture, which took 6 videos. That was brutal, wasn't it? But I mean, they're short, informative videos, but it's a brutal amount of work when you look back at it, because it took 6 videos to tell that story of 1,900 pictures. They said there have been some small fires on the site, all of which were put out rapidly. Wait, now you had a tsunami run through the site and 1,300 miles of the coastline. You're running around putting out fires. In one case, the Japanese authorities, which really pains me to say those words, initially said that one of the spent fuel ponds, and it's absurd to use the word pond, itself is on fire, and this was later retracted. In fact, Harvard University, or Yale or Stanford, I can't remember anymore, I think it was MIT. Should I find the video? Let's see. That didn't work out. Let me see if I can find a video, though, because I chopped that out. It's been quite a few years since we played it. I like it. Never mind. Let me see if I can find it, because I'm a sucker for punishment. God, it just threw the phone book at me. I'm looking for the ones that chopped MIT. Well, I don't know if it's MIT, Dana. It's not going to play anyway, so shut up, Dana. One more try. That video wouldn't work. Oh. Yeah, we'll never get it this way. No, not going to work. Okay, let's keep going. Such is life. Woe is me. Claiming they're putting out fires around this is absurd. Absurd lie. I wanted to show it, but I can't, unfortunately. In another case, the fire has been attributed to diesel engines. That was MIT or Harvard that done that, right? I should find it, like a working video of it. I'll find it after. And all the fires seem to have been outside pressure vessels. Look at that. Totally outside of it. Because it threw it a couple of miles away when it detonated, Dana. Oh, okay, that makes sense. Chernobyl, the pressure vessel was breached and the reactor had no containment. There, the core itself burned fiercely, largely because it was made of graphite. They couldn't get into the control room for 7 years after, by the way. The fires carried radioactive material from the reactor cores high into the atmosphere, where it spread far and wide. This cannot happen at Fukushima, so stop your fear-mongering, as it does not use graphite as a moderator. So you're saying that can't happen? And not only can that happen, but years later, some of it had went down to the earth, cracked the earth open, and the steams were coming out of the ground. You had to evacuate the site, and that steam was invisible plumes covering the planet eventually.
The Fukushima plants say the ground under the facility is cracking and radioactive steam is escaping through the cracks. The cooling system at the plant failed after the devastating tsunami hit Japan in March, sparking a nuclear crisis. But new evidence suggests that Fukushima reactors were doomed to cripple even before the massive wave reached them. Joining me now via broadcast.
And remember, right, the Harvard expert Gordo talking about 3 sieverts is a lethal dose in the plume off-site. There was 10 sieverts an hour at 6 places from the steam coming out of the ground. The video to the right is 40 times normal speed. That's just went on for days. In the right conditions, right? It's okay, let's keep rolling. What's the worst case scenario? Well, it's already happened multiple times. Difficult to be definitive because information is limited and often confused, which is true. But whoever wrote this story wasn't gullible or naive at all. And saying that the outcome will depend on the decisions that TEPCO, which is not a decommissioned authority, makes. And so TEPCO should immediately get out of the way. Right? The people that built the reactors should have been put in charge permanently and immediately. TEPCO know nothing about, didn't build it. They're just administration, right? They're not producers. They're not construction facility or something like that. Operators, which is that way you don't blame the nuclear industry, you blame a corporation. See? I mean, you should blame the nuclear industry. At the moment, the reactors themselves seem to be largely, and which is, they're also looking at it for future generations will blame TEPCO instead of nuclear. That's the idea, leaving them there. They were dysfunctional immediately because they were bankrupted right away. Everybody sold their stocks as quick as they could, and then trading was suspended. At the moment, the reactors themselves seem to be largely under control and are cooling rapidly. They're not under control and they weren't cooling rapidly. And so whoever concocted this story was really clever. They knew exactly what was happening. Meltdowns would only become possible for some inexplicable reason. The operator were to undo all they have done to date, which is, you're only at the 16th, 5 days in, which is they're detonating on that day. On top of that, there have been some leaks of radioactive material and will probably be more, partly because the containment systems have been breached, partly because radioactive steam may be regularly vented to allow more water in. You can't vent anything in a nuclear wasteland because it's a nuclear wasteland. Right? There's no way to vent something from these buildings. You can't turn a dial or push a button or anything else. The biggest threat now seems to be the spent fuel ponds. Again, every time I hear the word pond, it's absolutely absurd. On purpose, and they call the isotopes daughters, for goodness sakes. Nobody wants a daughter that evil, trust me. Where the water level has fallen, temperatures have risen. This could lead to fuel rods breaking open, releasing their radioactive content. So you go 2 years later, this is what Reactor 4 looked like. There's nothing left. So here's what it looked like to your left. There's nothing left. And here it is 4 years later. And then they're going to pretend that they're on top of the building that don't even exist. 2013 is to your right. However, the company operating Fukushima has now said for the fuel ponds of Reactor 4, the risk of recriticality is not zero, meaning a nuclear chain reaction could restart in the rods at the top of that building that don't exist anymore. Adding boric acid to absorb the neutrons should stop the reaction before it starts, but the building doesn't exist anymore. The mentally handicapped are working at it, so they'll get it fixed. Michael Marshall, the 17th of March, this is 6 days after the tsunami. He was from the Imperial College of London, who wrote that, got his name attached to the story written by a nuclear lobbyist that we just went through that time. This is a death zone. You can't work there. You can run through there and kumbaya la, my lord, and you're still going to get sick and die later from it. You're not going to work there. Possible meltdown of second reactor, 2012, after monster quake and tsunami. March 12th, this is the day after. It's highly possible and even probable that a partial meltdown was occurring in one of the nuclear disease factories damaged. And I mean, this is just the next day. Nobody knows. You got a tsunami, a massive earthquake, 1,300 miles of the coastline ripped off. The Japanese government spokesperson said today, measures were taken at Unit 3 at the Fukushima plant today, including releasing radioactive air and injecting seawater to reduce pressure and cool the reactor down to prevent a possible meltdown, said in Daini, who we've covered hundreds of times over the year. Now, this detonated a couple of days later. That's Reactor 3. The fuel pools at the very top of the building in two of those depictions up there, that's the reactor core here. So this was a couple of days after that story. Everything is gone. They couldn't cool it down. He also says it's highly possible there's been a partial meltdown in the unit of Reactor 3. Now this is the stump of Reactor 3 before they built a contraption off-site and put on top of that with cranes, and then claimed they were getting fuels out of the pool that would have been 100 feet above the wreckage you're looking at. We're taking measures on the assumption of the possible partial meltdown, he said. And here's what's actually left of Reactor 3 when they stripped away. Obviously, there's no fuel pool, there's no reactor core. In 2020, they claimed they got all the fuel out of the pool, despite the fact that that building doesn't exist, only a stump. So this cover story was really important, what we're going through tonight. It's probably the most important stuff, because it shows the conspiracy immediately in the first week. And this was the draft, is what we're covering. The government has earlier denied there was any possible meltdown. Now this is the 12th, or is it this one, the 12th? Let me go backwards. Yeah, this is the 12th. And they got their story almost straight already. And because we cover this a lot, 5 days a week, but we covered these details for years and years and years. And the consensus is they knew what was happening. Because they knew that they lost all external power and they lost on-site power, and that the whole coast was ripped apart. They couldn't do anything because everything was tore apart, right? All the wirings was tore off. You had to abandon the site immediately because of radioactive fallout from the detonations. And so there was no speculation. They knew the fuel pools were going to detonate. They couldn't cool it, right? This is all in. It's never supposed to happen, and you shouldn't have built it on a fault line where you got a 3,000-year recorded history of massive tsunamis, right? This was built to happen in many ways. But has since declined significantly, said the rods in the reactors were briefly exposed. You can't briefly expose it. It catches fire, produces noble gases, and then it'll detonate, which is exactly what we've seen happen repeatedly over and over in each of the reactors. And all cooling systems had failed at 6 of the reactors at 2 Fukushima plants, which is the Daini too, including the reactor, which we don't give a lot of attention to over the last few years, including the reactor that exploded. Now this is on the 12th, so this is only one day later, and experts have also feared a meltdown could occur. Well, once you've seen the whole coastline stripped, you know there's a meltdown coming. You don't. It's going to be somewhere the next day or hour or minute, but it's coming. It's definitely coming. Not maybe. It's guaranteed. And when you look at these pictures that TEPCO released later, these were, the first couple of months. Now, they were claiming, they got dates on all of this, and we went through every single picture, and there's no way the dates are accurate. This is much later. The site is one great big stupid mess even much later, let alone when it originally happened. Let me keep going here. According to the EP, Dano said the radiation around the reactors rose briefly above legal limits, but declined significantly. Said the rods in the reactors were briefly exposed. Now we know, right, this is madness to even suggest it, but this is March 11th or 12th. There's 18,000 people just got killed the day before in a tsunami. You had buildings swaying across the country from a 9-point magnitude earthquake. It shook, the buildings swayed and were left crooked, some of them. In Tokyo, for instance, they swayed for over 5 minutes. There was hundreds of aftershocks right away, large ones included. Cooling systems have failed. Fear to meltdown. Let me keep going. And the extent of the damage at the reactors and the cause of the explosions led the Japanese officials to order tens of thousands to evacuate the region around the plant. Now, Fukushima City, 60 kilometers away, was supposed to evacuate, but they wouldn't evacuate them. And we got our hands on the documentation, a lot of it, for Fukushima City. In fact, every house in Fukushima City was entitled to be decontaminated. So you can't decontaminate a nuclear radioactive house. You have to strip it down to the earth, take it away to a nuclear holding site, put a 12-foot chain link fence around it with universal signs on it to stay away from it, because it's a nuclear wasteland. And you have to do that to every house in Fukushima City, with over 300,000 people. According to Japan's Nuclear Industry Safety Agency independent body, there's no such thing as an independent body, nuclear. The only thing that could have caused the explosion was a meltdown of the reactor core. The only thing that could cause the explosion was a meltdown of the reactor core. This is TEPCO's picture, not mine, and I'm not very good with a camera either, so you're in a nuclear wasteland taking pictures. Back then, you were lucky to get 2 megapixel cameras, right? The only thing that could have caused the explosion was the meltdown of the reactor core. Japan continues to be shaken by aftershocks. And now we know these stacks are lethal doses. You're over 10 sieverts per hour. In fact, we have evidence of some of them being at 25 sieverts an hour. 3 sieverts is a lethal dose. The explosion early Saturday ripped through one of the buildings on the Fukushima Daiichi plant, injuring 4 workers, which was the number 3, which is number 3 right there. What's left of it. Radiation levels were high before the explosion, at one point releasing as much as radiation every hour as a person would normally absorb from the environment in a year. These are totally different. They got nothing to do with each other. And every time I see that, I'm really upset every time I read something like that, and it's a lot of times. When I see those types of connotations, I think whoever wrote it should be arrested and have to spend a couple of years in jail and lose their degree. That's how egregious I find that statement. It's criminal. It's 100% criminal to make a statement like that. To conflate natural with anthropogenic man-made radiation it's the lowest form of life. Only the lowest form of life would stoop to that level. And nuclear excels at it for some reason. which is why I would imagine that we got a poll. Is the entire batshit lunatic nuclear industry just one big stupid mass murder and genocidal human and species hating criminal empire? Daddy, you're making it too hard. Stop making such difficult polls. Just put in his nuclear scumbags. We'll figure it out on our own, Dana. There's a hellish picture right there, man. 3 evacuees were exposed to radiation, but enough showed signs of illness. At the end of the first year, there was 865,000 extra cancers. Japan authorities said their plans to distribute iodine to the victims around the disease factories in the nearby Daini plant too. They got a street there in 2012. The story came out. 7 people died on a single shopping street. Do you have a street in your country where 7 people dropped dead in 1 year? You got any idea how scary that is? 7 people on a shopping street. Honey, why do you keep sending me down to that same shopping street all the time? Because I love you, sweetie. There's a hellish job. In a nuclear wasteland looking for victims. So, like, the whole country was torn apart. But they're stoically in the nuclear wasteland venting the reactors, Dana. Tsunami survivors were plucked by helicopters and from rooftops, and hundreds more along the 1,300-mile stretch of coastline are waiting to be rescued. So they were waiting to be rescued in a 1,300-mile stretch of the coastline. 1,300-mile stretch of the coastline. As I normally say, it's 470 miles of the coastline, 600 plus kilometers of coastline, got stripped out to sea, right? Went through a wood chipper and then got tossed out to sea. But it was actually 1,300-mile stretch of the coastline. My goodness. My goodness. Isn't that something? Oh, I screwed that up, did I? That's okay. That's one of the few things I'm actually good at, is screwing that up. Here, let me put that over in the pile so I can find it later. Everybody's laughing at me now. Dana's being foolish again. Bear with me. I'm being foolish again. Alrighty, here we go again. She had 1,300 miles of coastline. The IAEA also admitted in June there was no such thing as a safe level of radiation. At 1,300 miles of the coastline stripped. There's 1 million households without water. 5 million households lacked electricity. So Fukushima never had none. Right? Entire villages were swept away. And I mean at 400 and 500 miles per hour on top of that. Hours after buildings stopped shaking, fires still burned, and Tokyo remained paralyzed with phone and train services halted. 4 million buildings were without power, and every kid in a nuclear wasteland will never stop having that nightmare, I bet. Can you imagine walking to school each day like that? So top you see the wave coming in, and as you come down you see the water starting to recede. It started to last a good 5 minutes, lots of shaking, pretty scary. I'm on the 11th floor. The Tokyo Tower in Tokyo, 200 plus kilometers away, is a famed landmark in Japan, and it now stands bent. Tsunami survivors were plucked by helicopters from rooftops, but hundreds more along the 1,300-mile stretch of coastline are waiting to be rescued. Fukushima, the salt problem. Because they were spraying the salt water on the reactors in desperation. So there is no salt problem because the reactors are gone, right? But it's worth remembering is the battle to prevent a massive radioactive release. What was the date on that? This is March the 24th. This is March 24th, 13 days later. 13 days later. Well, here's what the plume looked like worldwide after 13 days is over there. 19 days is right here. It's worth remembering as the battle to prevent a massive radioactive release, the Fukushima power plant approaches the end of its second week, which is 13 days over there, 324 hours. Actually, I don't even know what 324 hours is. Wait, hang on, I'll figure it out. 324 divided by 24 hours in a day, right? Correct me if I'm wrong. That's 13 days. So that is 13 days later. That model over there, the bottom left-hand corner, is 13 days of radioactive fallout. The bottom right-hand corner is 19.5 days. It's worth remembering the battle to prevent the massive radioactive release at the Fukushima power plant approaches the end of its second week. Best case scenario, emergency crews will restore cooling to the reactor cores and spent fuel pools and thus prevent the further release of radiation. And do jack shit in a nuclear wasteland when everything is already gone. So that's a pretty dishonest story on the 24th, because there's no way they didn't know the difference. Decommissioning of nuclear power plants, even one that hasn't suffered serious accidents, is an airy business. The plant is gutted until all that remains is an abandoned radioactive hulk that is locked up for hundreds of years before it can be dismantled. That at this point would be a dream outcome at Fukushima. Yeah, because most, like we covered a story last night where they were talking about 2070, they would try to start dismantling, I can't remember, Pilgrim was it or something? We cover so much. So normally it's like 50, 60 years or something like that. Japan's going to dismantle detonator reactors in 40 years, which is ludicrous because the reactors melted down. You can't dismantle. And wearing stupid plastic suits and paper suits can't protect you from the gamma shines, the X-rays, the neutron bombardments, the beta rays that are coming from the fuel assemblies that were tossed all over the site and from the reactor sites themselves. So, like, it's kind of hard to wrap your mind around. Where am I to? 960. I think I know what to tell you. Look, 'cause let's just talk about a healthy, normal reactor for a second. Where did I put that to? There you go. The ghostly glow of a nuclear power station detected in pure water 150 miles away. So it's 150 miles away. They had an experiment. It was buried under 1.25 kilometers of rock in Ontario, Canada. This is a few weeks ago. 12th of April, 2023. So they had what they call pure water, about a mile under rock in central Canada and Ontario, Canada. And they were looking for antineutrinos, which originated from a nuclear reactor 240 kilometers away, would light up the water it was a mile underground in rock. The running reactor with no meltdowns, the antineutrinos would go through a mile of rock, 150 miles away, 240 kilometers away, and a mile underground, and show up in mass. So imagine gamma shines, X-rays, neutron bombardments are going to do the same thing. They're infinitely more energetic. And so you can't shield yourself in that within 200 miles from that stuff. You can't. That's the reality of nuclear, see? Now I gotta find where I left off. Yeah, right here. So atomic salt. General Electric, which designed the reactors of Fukushima, estimated 57,000 pounds of salt were accumulated in reactor number 1, that's 13 days later, and 100,000 pounds in reactor 2 and 3. Now, I showed you a lot of pictures of reactor 2 and 3. There is no reactor 2 and 3, right? These pictures are the original pictures. It's a crazy industry anyway, no matter how you look at this. Determining safe level is like sort of question you would ask a PhD student applying for a job in the nuclear industry. So they're trying to put nuclear students on an incredible pedestal by making a statement like that. They're never going to go to Fukushima for starters. There is no universities, academics. And I've had polls asking, should nuclear students have to work at Fukushima? Because that would be the end of nuclear if they done that. And they're going to just grow up to be monsters. Well, Daini, no, they're innocent students in school. No, they're taking nuclear. They're not innocent anymore. They already know this is bad, and they continue hoping to get a job. And the only way to get the job is if they're extra evil. I remember, like, it was a long time ago, 14 years ago maybe, or longer than that. And Stanford had started posting lectures at its site. YouTube didn't exist at this point, right? And computers can barely play a video back then, so it was pretty low quality. But it was okay, you know, for technology at the time. But it was barely good playing videos back in those days, a computer was. And I was able to play the video anyway. I had to download patches or something to play the video. And I don't know, really. The question basically, it was the first day of class at Stanford. And it was a nuclear class. And so the students now were just introducing themselves to the professor. And one of the students said, "Hi, my name is," I'm not going to say a name because I can't remember it, so-and-so, right? And I said, she's an airhead. The way she was saying it, she's like a yuppie. And she said, I want to start killing humans right away. And the professor blew up laughing. He said, now, we got lots of time for that. This is day one. But he said, I appreciate it. I'll take note. She said, thank you. She was all happy with herself. Real pretty thing, too. And I was like, holy shit. Did I just hear that? And for weeks. I played that little clip over and over and over, and I was like, holy shit, man. What a maniac. But it was the way the professor responded. She said, like her parents told her to say that to the professor on the first day in class. Right? That's how I interpreted it anyway. On to the next one. Cesium fallout from Fukushima rivals Chernobyl. This is New Scientist, and they changed their tune all of a sudden on the 29th. And so the plume now has covered the planet by the 29th. And let's go back to that French model first. I'll show you two French models. Because I'm feeling lucky. So the French model showing the west coast with cesium-137 at 1 million to 10 million times so-called weapons fallout in Canada, United States, of cesium-137, which is cesium, by the way, is the cover story. That's one model from France. France released another model. This is what it looked like, and this is the model, it's the same French. So this model is based on 25 days. You speed it up to 200 times as normal percent, twice as normal speed. So after 20 days, this covers the whole planet. So this is 30 days later, actually, at this stage. But if I go backwards, that's 20 days right there of radioactive fallout. And when you put, which is the IRSN, France's government's experts in nuclear radiation, and their model of the cesium-137 was 1 million to 10 million times per square meter per, is that cubic? Yeah, that's cubic meter of air. 10 million of just, like, we got all kinds of different models of different isotopes, such as, Dana, yeah, well, hang on here. I think there's a plutonium model from TEPCO's numbers, for instance. And here's the americium-241, I think, which decays to plutonium. 239 decays to plutonium-239, which decays to plutonium-239. Cancer, but there's 1,800 diseases. So we hear the cancer, we hear that a lot, constantly. But radiation causes 1,300 diseases. It also compromises your immune system. So that makes you more susceptible to pathogens and viruses that were normally innocuous and benign and harmless. We would investigate the exposures and effects when the emergency phase is over. Secretary of United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation. We're not going in there for a couple of decades, let's put it that way. Radiation forecast withheld by the government. Releasing it would cause what they say unnecessary panic. France, like I just showed you, France's model is not unnecessary. This was unbelievable numbers, catastrophic numbers. Radiation forecasts withheld by the government because releasing it would cause panic. And they were going to evacuate Tokyo with 36 million people in metropolitan Tokyo. Radiation data also from the Seattle area withheld by the feds. And I showed you some of that many times. Like the xenon at 450,000 times, what they considered normal. You had, we'll probably get to them coming up actually. Courage of the Fukushima 50. Like when you hear Fukushima 50, I got no evidence. That's the whole thing about all these pictures, is there's no evidence of Fukushima 50, let alone, there's Fukushima maybe a dozen people altogether. In the 1900 videos that are dated and released, it's pretty rare to see anybody. And these are supposed to be shortly after the accident pictures. And all we see is some really basic stuff. We don't see any heroes, no stoic Japanese headed into the reactors, because as I showed you, the reactors are completely destroyed, right? And let's keep rolling. In fact, what you see is 60 and older should be prepared to die at Fukushima because nuclear scientists won't go near the site. So when you talk about the Fukushima 50, it's really dishonest. And there's a movie coming out on Netflix about that right now. And so I shouldn't pass judgment before I watched it. But because I've been at this so long, I think I'm entitled to. Nuclear workers accept their fate like a death sentence. Kamikazes. We covered a lot of this. Courage at Fukushima 50, suicide amidst workers trying to avert a catastrophe. And the date on that is long past the catastrophe. It's March the 17th, actually. And all the reactors have detonated by March the 17th. And this is their own picture, by the way. And steam billows from overheating reactor number 3. Overheating. So they're saying this is steam billowing from an overheated reactor that don't exist in the picture. And anybody that reads that has to ask the same question, well, where's reactor 3? There's nothing left. But that's how brainwashing works. These subtle lies. They're outrageous lies, but they're considered subtle. Another, having absorbed a near lethal dose of radiation, told his wife, "Please continue to live well. I cannot be home for a while." So this was about new worst case scenarios. Radiation in Tokyo could harm humans. Well, there was no doubt about this was harming humans. There was the mentally handicapped, as I showed many times over the years, that were working at Fukushima, still are. And often given, and when you say radiation suits, there really isn't anything as such thing as a radiation suit. It'd have to be a 4-foot thick lead suit. So saying they're given them secondhand paper suits is what they're talking about. It's pretty disappointing as a human species when you start comprehending the enormity of this topic, right? There's an undeniable enormity of this subject that is and let's do this poll. What am I doing wrong here? I wonder, is the entire nuclear industry just one big stupid genocidal human and species hate and criminal empire? Well, like when you're going through all of this information tonight, that's the only conclusion you'll ever come out with, unfortunately. The radiation levels at the plant entrance are at a level which will either kill the workers soon or cause them appalling illnesses in the years to come. Experts have said that the airtight suits they are wearing will do little to stop the contamination. Well, lead can't stop the gamma shines, the neutron bursts, the X-rays, and everything else. How can a paper suit? It's absurd, right? Well, because it's the unskilled and the destitute, the homeless, the victims of society, they're given the paper suits too. They don't know any better, right? It is thought that mostly older men have volunteered because they already had children. And younger workers might be rendered infertile by the high radiation doses. If you're rendered infertile by high radiation doses, you're dying that week or that day. At home, he doesn't seem like someone who could handle big jobs, his wife says. But today, I was really proud of him, and I prayed for his safe return. The British media is disgusting. They're worthless humans, man. There's the guts of Reactor 4. You can't get close to the stack to your left without getting a lethal dose. How bad? And now this picture is important because this was in Chiba. Yeah, Chiba Prefecture. It burnt on the day of the earthquake. And they lost around 1,500 pounds of depleted uranium they had stored there. That's what you see burning, is the depleted uranium. They gave them cardboard to hide behind. I said, you can go back home, never. We'll pay you for that, never. We'll help you out long after you're exhausted and gave up all hope. Another girl whose father worked at the Fukushima reactor said, I have never seen my mother cry so hard. She wrote on Twitter, people at the plant are struggling, sacrificing themselves to protect you. Please, Dad, come back alive. And if anybody knows of the British media, how bad they actually are, they used to hack dead children's cell phones so they can get messages from their friends so they could do a story. Kind of personalities. Rupert Murdoch's News of the World got closed down for specifically doing that regularly. He closed it down because he was afraid investigators would go back through the media and see how many thousands of times they manipulated scenarios that way. Of those who have stayed behind, 5 are known to have died. So they're claiming 5 people died right away. The pilots, all the pilots in Chernobyl, all 600 of them died, right? They only tried this in Japan once or twice and they gave up on it. Britain, which is pressing Japan to be more open, Britain worked with the nuclear industry to cover up Fukushima. We've covered it many times. And advised citizens to give the area a 30-mile berth and to quit Tokyo, leave Tokyo 150 miles, is actually almost 200 miles to the south. Yesterday, thousands headed to Tokyo airport, no time with the British, right? Should get out of Tokyo, to leave the country for whichever destination they could find. Just get out of Tokyo. Get out of Japan. 4 of the 6 nuclear reactors are cited hit by explosions and fires. Now, this is on the 17th, this story. It came out in 2012. Radiation forecasts can by no means be released to the public. Showed a radioactive cloud could spread over Tokyo. But now we have the numbers from Tokyo, and not could, it did, right? There was the Chinook helicopter flying at less than 300 feet dropped 4 loads of water over the wrecked buildings in the hope that some water would seep into the dried out pools and cool the fuel. The dried out pools, once they're dry, well, they go dry because they caught fire and they evaporated all the water that was left around. And once the water gets so low, or the fuel rods are exposed, they catch fire. And then that heat will evaporate the rest of the water, and the rest of the fuel will catch fire. Now, the fuel doesn't need oxygen, so it can catch fire underwater, too. In Chernobyl, all 600 helicopter pilots died.
It was heroism.
During this operation, 600 pilots are fatally contaminated with radiation. All of them will die. But their efforts only buy a few days. Although it has been covered over, the fire still isn't out.
So all 600 of those pilots died. But here's the media on the 17th saying the fuel pools were dried out. Right? there's a good picture. Those stacks, just being by them is a lethal dose. Imagine being by the melted reactors. Dried out fuel pools, including Reactor 1, which is what you're looking at. However, radiation levels within the plant rose from 3.7 sieverts to 4 sieverts an hour immediately afterwards, which are lethal doses right away. You'll die that day or that week if you're only there for a few moments. So they went in and got the original pictures and then ran away again, right? It's not like they're gonna. We don't see like groups of 50 or 60 or hundreds working in any of the pictures after 12 years. People exposed to the doses will suffer radiation sickness. Many will die. Today, Tokyo Electric Power, which owns the plant, will try to restart the reactor's cooling system. This is the time at the Daini reactor, I think. After workers connected a half-mile-long power cable from the national grid to Reactor 2. Right, and so they allegedly ran a cable for a mile underground through the tsunami wreckage and over all the wreckage to Fukushima, or to the Daini plant, which is 10 kilometers down south, and connected to reactors. Now, they had thousands of tons of water in the reactor buildings. The tsunami is the same height. The tsunami ran through 1,300 miles of the coastline. The tsunami started right off Fukushima Prefecture. It's 60 kilometers off, 70 kilometers rather offshore. Right? So Daini was just right there. It's not like Daini was 700 kilometers down the coastline. Daini was right there. It's the same level as the Daiichi, which is 10 kilometers away. They're twins. They're identical. And so whatever happened at Fukushima for water tsunami-wise, maybe I can find it for you. Hang on. Would have happened at Daini. We got lots of pictures of Daiichi, but not many pictures. Very, very, very few of Daini. In fact, I got a folder on Daini that still has no pictures of Daini. Just bear with me. That's one of the problems with I got so much. I was hoping to find a tsunami tearing through the site. Oh, there's not. All hope is not lost yet. Here we go. So this is the Daiichi site. Let me find another picture to go with it. Can't always get what you want. You get what you need. Well, actually, let me play this clip of the announcement. And you can hear the translator at Al Jazeera, her voice starts to crack.
The Japanese Prime Minister appeared on TV to put into play a plan they'd rehearsed for years.
We will secure the safety of the people of Japan, and in order to minimize the damage, the government will make every effort possible. And we ask the people of Japan to continue to be cautious and vigilant and keep tuned in to the reports on the television and radio. And we ask the people of Japan to act calmly.
Of course, they were panicking. So the bottom center one, that would have happened to the Daini plant too. In fact, all these pictures would have been exactly the same at the Daini plant. or similar, right? Last night, 14,000 were confirmed dead or missing in Japan, and 500,000, half a million, were homeless. And all these pictures, you'll never see a bunch of workers. A radioactive plume from the crippled, which is actually destroyed, Japan nuclear reactors could reach the west coast of America and Hawaii as soon as today, according to United Nations forecast. We got a lot of documentation, 1 million becquerels a square meter over the west coast of the United States and America and Canada. Rain with 20 million particles of radioactive iodine per liter fell on the United States during post-Fukushima peak. The radiation is expected to head into Southern California and further into Nevada, Utah, Arizona. It could blow to 5,000 miles across the Pacific Ocean through next week, increasing radiation levels. Well, after 20 days, it covered the whole planet. After 27 days, it covered absolutely everything. Another study out of Ottawa, Canada, the West Coast was hit with 220 million atoms per liter of iodine 129 in rain after Fukushima, with a 15 million year half-life. Detected in aquifers that supplies the drinking water to large numbers of people. It was transported rapidly to Canada and the United States. Elevated levels, and 220 million atoms per liter is elevated levels, continued for months. Well, it never stopped melting down. So this, see, it's a continuous plume, right? That's a continuous plume. So when you look at this over, that's a continuous plume covering the entire planet. It's all the way from the ocean floor to the upper atmosphere, troposphere. And so what you expect to see is incredible harm. Particularly noticeable would be everything in the tidal zones, and also insects and birds. That would be really noticeable. So if you go back over that period, and this is what we've done all kinds of research on species. And we've done extensive, year after year after year after year. We're still trying to do it today. Last year was a particularly rough year for me. This year is, I still got a lot to get through this year, but we're going to try to do something when the weather breaks, hopefully. It could be blown 5,000 miles across the Pacific Ocean through next week. So then they show you these pictures of dogs that escaped and survived the tsunami, and they wanted something, it's heartbreaking pictures. Dogs that symbolize bravery of people. A video of 2 dogs lost in the chaotic aftermath of the earthquake disasters helped bring together the shell-shocked Japanese people. They were showing, a week later, a dog on tsunami debris 100 miles offshore. And that too was meant to symbolically focus away from Fukushima onto the dogs, right? Fukushima marks the end of the nuclear era for France or Germany. I think imagine 1,300 miles of coastline getting ripped off out. It was 2,000 square miles debris field after this in the Pacific. So not counting what sank and everything else, what didn't get dragged out to sea. Japan was still reeling from its largest recorded earthquake when an explosion struck the Fukushima Daiichi plant on Saturday. This is on the 14th of March. This is 3 days later. Despite government assurances there was fears of another Chernobyl, the incidents has sparked a heated political debate in Germany and looks likely to end the dream of cheap and safe nuclear power. What a despicable thing to say. Really, right? That like when you understand the context, That's a pretty despicable thing to say. Call it safe like that. It's completely dishonest and disingenuous. Fukushima spent fuel rods pose grave danger. March the 15th. This is the same week. So almost all the stories are within 1 week. I know the headline says the first month. Hey, I think that's more to do with all those pictures that I'm dragged in from the original releases by TEPCO, right? You can, because it's hard to comprehend the chaos of what that site was really like without the evidence for people. A lot of people can't visually, don't have anything. The media is not going to give them this kind of stuff so that they can comprehend the real bigger on their own, because you can extrapolate so much from a picture. Like you can see the buildings are torn apart everywhere. Those drums are squeezed, and destruction and debris laying everywhere. Even these are the original pictures that TEPCO released. And as we go through these pictures, you're getting further and further away from the day that it happened, right? These pictures came out with dates, and I've done whole entire presentations on these pictures. Let me see. There's no windows, no frames, no furniture, no curtains. Everything is torn apart, everything is wrecked. And when you look through this stuff, you start appreciating how much of the infrastructure is completely wrecked. So the experts were aware of what I'm showing you. And that's probably the most people I got in 1,900 pictures in the one place. And what they're doing is they're in paper suits, and there's nothing physical they can do. There's nothing that's going to work. There's no valves you can turn is going to change anything, for instance, right? And if you're not an expert. If you're there with a paper suit on, you're not an expert. That's not somewhere an expert's going to go. And claiming this is millisieverts right at the ground zero is absurdness. This was meant to allay fears, right? This was meant 100% as propaganda. Now these things are maxed out. Look at this. And it's completely dishonest to use a Geiger counter at a nuclear meltdown that only measures 10 millisieverts. So that's probably a sievert, right? 10,000? Because it would have different settings, but with no explanations. That's what the average person is going to take. So this is 2.8 millisieverts, but this is a nuclear meltdown site. And this could only measure, say, gamma or whatever, right? Again, you're at a nuclear meltdown in a paper suit. Look at the boys in the background there. Now, what he's doing is he's spraying a reagent because they assume there's fuel pellets, particulates there, and that are splitting the atoms. And so they want the green, ironically green reagent that he's spraying is meant to bind with the fuel particulates that are splitting atoms and stop the atoms from wafering in the air. That's the idea. So he would have died that day for sure. Whoever's got that job is dying that day. There's no way those people will die that day. That's an incredible picture. That's an absurd picture. That's one of the most heartbreaking pictures I've ever seen. Fukushima spent fuel rods pose grave dangers. Even if the reactor containment vessel, this is March the 15th, so the next day was Reactor 3 detonated, Pools of spent fuel rods could combust and release clouds of radioactive cesium and uranium, and plutonium and americium and neptunium and strontium and everything else into the air. Every time I see the word cesium, I actually get upset. And I hate that, but it offends me that much. A calamity that could happen at the U.S. nuclear plants as well. Well, 1 year later, it was 865,000 extra cancers. Cancer is just one of 1,800 diseases. 4 atomic reactors in Fukushima, Japan seem to be in partial meltdowns. Well, when you look at reactor 3, that's not a partial meltdown. And this is on the 15th, so everything is forgiven because these people, but we're doing retrospectively, right? We're saying, well, here's the evidence. But, you know, when you read these stories, you come to the conclusion that this is a lobbyist, a pro-nuclear lobbyist wrote the story, the media published it. That's how they make their money. And that whoever the pro-nuclear wrote the original story and gave it to the media had to be pretty friggin' intelligent to write the story the way they did. And you can't write that story without understanding the big picture. Because this is the very original cover story that we're covering. So one of the most important videos I'll probably post this year is this particular video. Hence, I'm taking my time and sticking to the facts only. The situation is spinning out of control. The radiation level spike. One of them, reactor 2, seems to have ruptured. Meanwhile, reactor, sometimes I get confused because we've been covering so much for so long. But that's only on dates. You're talking about 24-hour confusion. It's still happening, right? U.S. Navy has pulled back its aircraft carrier, the U.S. Ronald Reagan, which was actually 1 kilometer away from the meltdowns. In fact, the crew was so sick with radioactive fallout. First off, all their digital watches stopped at the same time. And massive amounts of people had diarrhea, and the toilets were plugged up, and they were excreting in the hallways and everything else. A very graphic story, but you got to tell the story for the world to appreciate and comprehend the severity. And then they were denied health care. They were ostracized and then victimized by the nuclear industry to protect the nuclear industry. They were sacrificial, and you're talking 5,000 people were thrown under the bus so the nuclear industry can pretend it had some redeeming qualities. 17 of his crew were exposed to radiation while flying 60 miles off the Japanese coast. They were actually 1 kilometer off the reactors. Despite 3 major explosions of reactor number 1, then number 3, then number 2, the Fukushima containment vessels seem to be holding. The explosion of reactor 2 clearly is not holding. There's another potentially far more dangerous problem, reactor 4. Storage pools are packed with radioactive uranium rise several stories above the ground. They're at the very top of 190-foot buildings. And always close to the reactor. Because they have to they transfer the assemblies from the reactor cores into the pools underwater. It never comes out of the water. So the reactor core is at the top of the buildings too. Where the fuel pools, right? They have gates, and the lid is like 300,000-pound lid on these things, right? And you'll bring in 1,000 outside people because they're going to get serious doses for the changing of the fuel. But spent fuel rod pools, which should be illegal to call them pools, are actually highly radioactive, very unstable, extremely dangerous, and paired with reactors not well supported, contained, or looked over. They have no containment. The spent rods give off considerable amount of decay heat, which is physical atoms. That's how the heat is created, by splitting atoms, and thus must be submerged in constantly circulated water. And the water has to constantly circulate, and it'll boil off about 120,000 liters a day. Each liter is going to be saturated with isotopes that's released into the communities and the environment. It never goes away on top of that. And all pools do it, and they've been doing it for 80 years. And that's why we see global warming. Global warming is 80 years of emissions, and the radiation itself is pulsing energy every second at the speed of light. And it destroys all the bases of the food chain, the bases of the oxygen chain, the bases of the carbon sequestering chain. And after 80 years of it, they've almost completed their job. Expose them to air for a day or two and they begin to combust. No, they combust within minutes. As soon as you expose them, they self-ignite the zirconium cladding. So when you go back to the 40s and 50s, when they used to use zirconium flash, those flashes were contained. And so what you done was you broke the container for the flash. That's how you had the flash. Was oxygen got into the container, and that caused the zirconium flash for the cameras in the old days to break flash and light up everything, which was a dirty bomb, right? It's the same thing as a dirty bomb. And so it's the same thing with the fuel rods. When they're exposed to air, they flash. They'll burn at 1800 degrees. That'll ignite the uranium plutonium pellets. They'll burn at 9,000 degree Fahrenheit temperatures. And so this is really dishonest. And in order to write the article they wrote, they knew that was dishonest. That's on purpose, that deceit. So that's pretty nasty. The explosive reactors 1 and 3 blew apart the respective containment buildings, but left the vessels intact, or so we think. But what did the blast do to nearby spent fuel rod pools? On Monday night, the news in Japan confirmed the pool next to Reactor 3 lost its roof. Lost his roof. Sorry. Let me find something appropriate in this madness that we got. Well, the problem is I got so much. That's the top of Reactor 1, I believe. Yeah, Reactor 1. 2011. That's April the 1st. They didn't lose the roof, they were just torn apart. They lost their entire inventories. They lost, except for, well, not except for Reactor 2, which is what you're looking at there, lost its inventory. But it went China syndrome down into the earth, unlike Reactor 3 and 4. Which ejected, some of Reactor 4 went China syndrome. And Reactor 3 was completely ejected out of the building. And there was some left over, obviously, right? Some ejected down into the building. But Reactor 2, liquefied reactor core, cooked at 9,000 degrees. It would have cooked the fuel pools right above it. There's no way to get near it. These are lethal doses. And seeing these people there, you're getting lethal doses to work in that environment. Smoke coming from Reactor 3, steam coming from the spent fuel pools next to it indicates the water in the pool is boiling. That means the spent fuel rods are getting hot and could start burning. If they're boiling, then they're burning. They're burning because they're boiling. They boil off the rest of the water. Huge amounts of radioactive material will be released to the atmosphere, dispersed across the northern hemisphere. And that looks like this right across the northern hemisphere, but it covers the whole planet, 19 days. Damaged fuel rod pools. Well, pools is better than ponds. That's right. This is Robert Alvarez, who sold us out so many times I lost track of it. We're talking about things that were never considered a credible threat pre-Fukushima. All I had to do was destroy the electronics on the site so even the backup generator can't feed it and it'll melt down. At the plant, they seemed to dismiss the concerns about spent fuel pools. At the prefecture, they were very worried but had no plans on how to deal with it. which means it shouldn't exist, right? Because you still haven't got a plan to deal with it. There is no plan to deal with it. Once it starts melting, you better run like you've never ran in your life. The spent fuel pools at the reactor, Fukushima not equipped with backup water circulation systems or backup generators for the water circulation systems they do have. So they assume that it can't happen. Nuclear safety activists in the United States have long known of these problems, have sought repeatedly to have them addressed, at least get backup generators for the pool they implored. And just one day before the earthquake hit Japan, the non-regulatory agencies recommended a 20-year renewal for Vermont Yankee nuclear license. 20-year renewal. Instead of a 10-year renewal or a 5-year renewal, you get a 20-year renewal. And the problem is the reactors get brittle from neutron bombardments and gamma shines and X-rays and beta rays, right? How's the poll going? I don't know, Dana, why don't you go look? Well, here I am, magically. Is the entire nuclear industry just one big stupid, genocidal, human and species-hating criminal empire? Yeah. That's exactly what it is, Dana. There's a problem with the dry cask storage. It costs money. Why is that a problem? The track record of atomic energy industry in the United States, less so in Japan, is to spend as little money as possible and extend the life of old plants for as long as possible, no matter the risk. And that's exactly what we see going on, too. They're desperate for one in America. In Japan, they wait for news. Are the pools stable or leaking and boiling? That was on the 15th, that story. So yeah, they were leaking and boiling and melting down. Maybe I made a mistake. It's reactor 4 that blew up on the 16th. Is it? Reactor 3 blew up on the 15th. I get confused sometimes, my apology, and that's not acceptable, I know. But it's been a while since we walked that road, and because we cover 24-hour news cycles so much, my brain can only pocket it so much information. Does potassium iodine, this is on March the 15th also, does potassium iodine protect people from radiation leaks? Leaks. Like, that's not a leak. You can't call a plume covering the entire planet a leak, despite that's exactly what they're doing. And which is completely dishonest, right? So you're not trying to have a conversation, you're trying to downplay every facet of it. Thyroid cancer ends up being the biggest negative health impact caused by Chernobyl. No, it was Alzheimer's and dementia and autism, diabetes and Down syndrome, schizophrenia and heart problems, liver problems, lung problems, respiratory, pituitary, thyroid, adrenaline. It wasn't just thyroid, which in thyroid's a big deal because you're mutating the thyroid, the hormones in your thyroid and distributing that through the bodies. So that's brutal on species and insects. But there's a bigger picture, and if you ignore the bigger picture, you're not comprehending the enormity of this equation, right? And you're not able to extrapolate properly. So my apologies if I don't always drive that point home. According to the report issued last month by the United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation, which are the complete opposite of what they're claiming, they're not a regulatory agency. They don't have any authority or anything like that. Japan earthquake, iRobots sending packed bots and warriors to the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant. Well, they can go in, and it's laughable in some sense, I know, but they can go in and take radiation readings and stuff like that. You can sacrifice them instead of the homeless and the destitute, so that's a good thing, right? That doesn't mean it's going to work, but this was they were sending them down. They were sending down manpower, and they were going to be hiding in They're going to be hiding in vehicles and remotely controlling it. And I don't know how that panned out because they never gave us any updates on it. U.S. carrier Ronald Reagan passed through the radioactive plume off to Japan's coast. We got evidence that says it's 1 kilometer away from the reactors. So it would have been brutal numbers. Low level radioactive plume from the troubled Fukushima nuclear plant located 100 miles away. March the 14th, it was headed in to Fukushima and it was running into the plume off the coastline. The ship's crew was exposed to very low levels of radiation. Very low levels. Like anything coming from a nuclear meltdown are hot particles. There's no such thing as a low-level hot particle. And these were considerable plumes we're actually talking about. According to the 7th Fleet Commander and spokesman Jeff Davis, who sold out everybody under his command, he said the maximum potential radiation doses received by any ships, and there was a lot of ships, there was around 30 ships or something. Operation Tamagotchi, I think it was, something like that. Any ship's force personnel aboard the ship when it passed through the area was less than the radiation exposure received from about 1 month of exposure to natural background radiation from rocks and soils in the sun, said the 7th Fleet Commander and spokesman Jeff Davis. So you know why he's the 7th Fleet Commander? Because he'll slaughter his own crew, his own soldiers, so he can be a big shot in a suit. Truly, one of the most despicable things you can do is imply that it's got something to do with rock, soil, and the sun. It's really, truly a low. You're a low-life degenerate scum when you do that. You're the lowest form of humanity possible. Yeah, and you should be jailed and lose any degrees you got when you use that assessment. That's a complete dishonest and disingenuous assessment. Low amounts of radioactive material have been released into the atmosphere. Hot particles from a nuclear meltdown are released into the atmosphere, is how that should read. As plant officials desperately try to prevent the meltdown in nuclear cores, and this is on the 14th, so we'll give them some latitude. At the 14th. But look, you know, if you're making that kind of statements because you're in the know, and that's the propaganda. So there's no honor in the military, let's put it that way. And by the 14th, a couple of reactors had already melted down. So low level, that offends me that somebody would say that. Xenon for Fukushima. Didn't we cover a story last night of a xenon plume? Where they were, that was 3 Mile Island, I think it was, wasn't it? Yeah. Xenon will burn a hole through the lungs and end up in your bones. For children and insects and mammals, it'll mutate their stem cells. You can guess what happens after that. That's why they have children wards at the hospital, because of that particular effect of radiation. The best way to get rid of cancer is to close down all nuclear power plants. Danger posed by radioactivity in Japan is hard to assess. It's not if you're honest. It's really easy if you're honest. Iodine pills will be distributed to residents around the Fukushima Daiichi and Daini plants. Both experienced multiple failures. I'm gonna have to do that whole folder in the Daini plant. Why wait, Dana? I don't know. Hang on. Let's do a few for a bit of ha. I got no idea where I put it, so let's keep our fingers crossed. Daini. Because I have so much. There we go. There we go. Oh my God. Hang on, I'm almost ready. There we go. Let's try that. 10 of them, I think, or 9 of them or something. We're focused on ensuring Unit 4 in Daini is kept stable condition and fixed in the 3 other units at the Fukushima Daiichi plant. So they're suggesting 4 reactors needed to be fixed. TEPCO president mentions an accident at the Fukushima Daiichi, not just Daiichi. A book by a Fukushima worker. The bottom of the Daini reactor may be broken through. Rumors of a possible explosion. Fukushima Daiichi still receives lots of radioactive fallout from the Fukushima Daiichi. The smoke seen rising from Fukushima Daiichi after the quake, but before the tsunami. That was a Daini reactor. Smoke was rising before the tsunami got there. Fukushima Daiichi also had a major damage from 311, submerged under 12 feet of water. Daini workers need emergency rooms after being at Unit 4. Unable to decontaminate exposed people, the plants are not safe. So that's a pretty significant statement right there. That's a holy shit type statement right there. Fukushima Daiichi had 3,000 tons of radioactive water in the reactor buildings. So that's game over. Fukushima Daiichi reactor has broken the containment vessel caused by the quake, not the tsunami. Reactor 3, or Reactor 1 detonation. That's Reactor 1 detonating at the Fukushima Daiichi, not the Daini. Environmental Protection Agency says that everyone in the United States is exposed to very small amounts of cesium-137 in soil and water because of atmospheric fallout from nuclear detonations. Cesium-137. Well, here's the cesium-137 model from France's IRSN government agency, showing 1 million to 10 million times per cubic meter in the air of cesium-137. So suggesting that everyone's exposed to 137 from weapons testing is excluding what the French was asserting. How close are we? Let's get through it. Let's keep going. We'll get through everything that I got there in that pile, because it's been sitting there for almost 5 years. So if I don't do it, it'll never get done. Pregnant women are, this is already 5 years, almost overdue. And I was, I don't know, like I wasn't, I'm getting hard to get motivated sometimes. Today I was really hard to get motivated. I was doing a news cycle and I just wasn't motivated. And here we go. I wasn't motivated, and so I said, I'll take out one of these old folders and I'll have a look at it. Maybe I'll do a show on that. When I looked at it, I was like, perfect. I'll do that show tonight. And that'll get me. Because just as you can see all night long, I get upset. I'm trying to contain it, but. So here's the timeline, and I make mistakes like everybody else, but Reactor 1 melted down on the 12th. Reactor 2 melted down on the 14th, and there was another explosion on the 15th. Reactor 3 melted down on the 14th. So Reactor 2 and Reactor 3 melted down on the 14th, and the explosion destroyed the building. No, it destroyed the fuel pool of the reactor core, ejected right out of the building. And number 4 detonated and had fires on the 15th and 16th. In fact, I think there was 4 fires in those 2 days. So I was saying earlier, March 16th was Reactor 4. or reactor 3 was was the 16th, but it was reactor 4. But I do believe there was another explosion on the 16th. That's probably why I was using it. And so I apologize. Sue me. Helicopters were used to drop water on the reactor buildings 3 and 4. Yeah, but just a couple of times, and they gave up on it because all 600 helicopter pilots at Chernobyl died in the first few weeks. In Reactor 4, 2 major fires broke out after storage pools designed to cool the used nuclear fuel rods ran low on water. Once it runs low, now it's burning at 9,000 degree Fahrenheit temperatures, and it doesn't need oxygen. So it'll burn right down in the water, and it'll boil off whatever's left, right? Once it starts burning, it's going to go. There's no containing it. You can't stop it because it doesn't need oxygen. It burns, the chain reaction is, all it is splitting atoms originally, right? But once it goes into China's a liquefied mass, so to speak, is burning at 9,000 degree Fahrenheit temperatures, it just annihilates the water. That disappears pretty quick. The explosion of Reactor 2 damaged the suppression chamber, a water-filled structure below the main reactor that condensed steam. Experts believe this caused a mass discharge of radioactive material. No, Reactor 2 burned continuously for several days. The only way you can do that was if you lost all the inventories, the fuel pools and the reactor cores. And engineers believe the fuel rods and remember the date on this is March the 27th. So you're 16 days out. So this is what the plume looked like worldwide by day 19. That's day 13 over there. This is 19.5 days of radioactive fallout. Because we're doing this retrospectively. We're just going to burn through the rest of it because we're getting up there, are we? We must be up there now. Oh yeah, we're up there. Let's keep going. We're almost there. A Japanese 3-mile island. Accident at Fukushima Daiichi power plant. The government's clumsy response. There was no response. You can't. How do you respond to a nuclear meltdown? You run away. That's why nuclear is stupid. Both resemble a 1979 U.S. nuclear disaster. A 3-mile island, like a Japanese 3-mile island. That's an insult. That's a complete insult to conflate that. Now, I'm sorry, this is March the 12th. That story is March the 12th. I was thinking March 27th, last story. Don't worry about it. I'll get back on track. We'll finish this out. The accident at the Fukushima Daiichi power plant and the government's clumsy response both resemble a 79 U.S. nuclear disaster, which is the 3-mile island. And again, I hate that word partial meltdown. It drives me nuts because we covered this extensively. As far as I know, you can't have in that kind of scenario, everything melts. Was indeed the worst. No, the worst commercial nuclear power accident, the worst commercial in U.S. history, the worst commercial. And so that way they don't have to bring up the national laboratories or hang on. Maybe I'll get lucky and find it. Oh. How good is that? There we go. How lucky is that? Well, it's not luck I put it there so I could find it, but 50 years after America's worst nuclear meltdown, that was 2018. Updated 2018. It was originally 2009, 60 plus years now. This was 1959. Santa Susana released almost 460 times the amount of radiation that was released at 3-Mile Island. But this wasn't a commercial reactor, right? It was still a nuclear meltdown. It was equal to 460 3-Mile Islands melting down at the same time. So Santa Susana was equal to 463 Mile Islands worth of radiation. So it's very dishonest the way they framed that narrative, isn't it? Let's move up to March 21st, 10 days after. The trouble passed at Fukushima had a stricken nuclear plant failed safety checks and crammed its reactor building fuel pools with uranium, with fuel rods that they could stand. So the fuel pools were stuffed. This was a story about it back in 2011. The reactor fuel pools were stuffed as much as they could. They were crammed with more uranium that was designed to hold. It has come out. So that's a super important story. Let me put that where I can find it. There you go. And the Fukushima nuclear power plant had one of the worst safety records for nuclear facilities in Japan. It was crammed with uranium rods when the Quake struck, documents revealed. There's a stump of reactor 3, and this is reactor 3 here, and reactor 4 over there. Completely reactor 1 right there. Workers in radiation protection suits. These are not radiation protection suits. They're going to be big, stupid lead suits, and you can't move in them. Now no one is going to accept nuclear waste in their backyard. Thank goodness, right? And we put you in cardboard boxes, and you get sick and die for all week here. So they're claiming 4,000 uranium fuel assemblies were stored in deep pools of circulating water in the highest floor of the Fukushima reactor buildings, which works out to 7 million pounds that are no longer in the buildings, obviously. But it was infinitely more than that. There could easily be 10 million pounds in each building, if I remember the math that we've done quite a bit. Because they don't have a repository, they got nowhere to store it, right? And they always say, well, reactor 4 was switched off for maintenance. Yeah, but you only take out no more than half the fuel at a time. So half the fuel was in the reactor core. We already went through that, right? 2 Fukushima workers are hospitalized after severe radiation exposure. We're almost through. The workers were exposed to radiation ranging from 170 to 180 millisieverts, according to the Japan's Nuclear Non-Safety Agency, which is complete dishonest. It's completely dishonest to suggest 170 to 180 millisieverts, which is still a brutal dose, don't get me wrong, but you're at a nuclear meltdown. Nuclear blast rocks Japan's nuclear plants. That was the March 13th. That's March 13th. There's reactor 4 gone, but it's the 14th in Japan's date, right? Because they're 12 hours ahead of us. It was the 13th on our date. So it's easy to get confused on the dates anyway. Squeen, what the hell is a squeen, Dana? I don't know. I'm wondering about that myself. That wasn't me. That was... okay, it was me. A screen grab taken from news footage by Japanese public broadcast showed a moment, and like to call it a hydrogen explosion on the 13th? Really? To use that word on the 13th? That's the cover story, see? Well, like, do you really, that's the fuel pools and the reactor cores falling out of the sky up there, by the way. Let's get through it. Japan's radioactive food found in major local producers. Really? Is somebody surprised? International Atomic Energy says Fukushima fallout warranted more evacuations. This was the IAEA. We actually got them saying it. Nuclear workers take risks for the public good, March the 18th. 300 workers at Fukushima Daiichi plant in Japan are trying to prevent the crisis from becoming something worse, which we know now is not true, right? Because it's a lethal dose. Once the first one went, all you can do is run away. 17 suffered what the Japan government calls disposition of radioactive material to their face. They have radioactive fallout to their faces. Disposition. is usually used to describe the fallout from the sky over a country, not to your face. Our cases, man. Japan's nightmare gets even worse. All 3 damaged nuclear reactors now in meltdown. Then they show you reactor 3 detonating. We're almost there, yay. 5, 10, 15, 16, 17 or so to get through. Fukushima, very low levels of radiation reached United Kingdom. Poison particles from nuclear plant found in at least 12 U.S. states. Well, let's look at the fallout. What date is that? That's March the 30th. Huh. That's March the 30th too, right there where my finger is. 19 days later. It poisoned the whole planet. More is coming. Air filters in Alabama and rainwater in Pennsylvania, Massachusetts. Residents have been warned not to use rainwater, which is being collected. So they're claiming that the radioactive fallout is just followed randomly, right? But we know now that that's completely dishonest. Monitoring stations: Alaska, Alabama, California, Guam, Hawaii, Idaho, Nevada, Saipan, Northern Mariana Islands, Washington State over the past week. Also reported in Massachusetts, rainwater by state officials, nuclear power plant radiation sensors in Colorado, South Carolina, North Carolina, Florida, Pennsylvania. Canadian food unharmed by Japan radiation so far. March the 30th, Canada was covered. In fact, we already showed a study from Canada of 220 million atoms per liter of rainfall sustained of iodine-129. From Ottawa, no less. And he said because Canada's not shipping food in there, that's why. Just because Canada hasn't imported any Japanese food since March 11th. Yeah, right. Fallout's not real, Dana. Well, how about this story here? This story should just boggle your mind. Canada lifts the restrictions on Japanese food imports June the 14th. June the 14th. 93 days later, Canada's lifted all restrictions on food imports from Japan. June the 14th. Became the first country to lift all restrictions. No longer sees the need for routine testing of imported food products, effective the same day the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. Canadian media didn't report on it. The agency has demanded test results verifying pre-dat the safety of the product from 12 prefectures. So Japan couldn't ship their food to 55 of the major countries worldwide. The only country they could ship the food to was Canada. And 93 days after the meltdown started, Canada was poisoned and everybody in it. And majority of them don't even know it right now. But that's the fact. It's hard to get motivated today for some reason. And so I done this show tonight instead. I done the same work as I do every other day. It never stops. It's just, I was feeling down. And that doesn't stop me from working though. Just because I'm not feeling good, don't feel like it. I don't got a right to stop. And I didn't. And how long did I go tonight? Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. It's almost 3 hours. Might as well do a shootout, I suppose. And I do 3 hours, might as well do a shootout, Dana. It was a brutal show tonight. Holy shit. Well, we're off till Sunday, so hopefully I can recover by then. Bloody journalists, eh? Can't live with them, can't live with them. We should rename journalists like monsters or demonic demons or something. Call them what they are, right? Scumbags. So we still got a poll. Let's close that off. Is the entire nuclear industry just one great big stupid monstrous genocidal human and species hating criminal empire? Why, yes it is, Dana. Yes it is. Yeah, I have to agree. That's a great poll tonight. Thank you, everybody. Good night, everybody. Dana Nasana. Hi, Dana. 239 Giant. Hi, Joe. Noble. Vast Thinker. Port Angeles. Richard. Dark Knight. Good night, everybody. Kevin Blanche. Hi, Kevin. Anthony. You're welcome. Chandra Wolf Churchill. James Lucid. Good night, everybody. Ryan Underwood. The Minnesota Monticello leak. Nothing lately, no. That's a good point. I'll look into it tomorrow. I'm just coming down from the names of the comments that are available on the inside. Doing a quick shout out. I'm just going to boogie down. Mr. Finnegan, Peaceware, John Shiflett, Mulu Takes, and we're almost down through the names. Well, we're halfway down. Angel's Place. Hi there. John Curtis, PBS Lover. I heard you lost your mom recently. My heart goes out to you. H9000. Did I get everybody? Just for most recent comments, we'll get to them in a minute here. If there's anybody new I didn't get to. I know Colette is out there. Hi, Colette. So we're just doing shout-outs once in a while. You're welcome, PBS Lover. Yeah. And they get everybody, don't jab the children. Yeah, looks like we got everybody. Looks good. Time is here. It's 7 minutes to 1 a.m. I do my shows late at night so there's no background noises. So the end of my days are 5 days a week. The very last thing I do is the show. It's very difficult to do your shows as the last thing of the day because you got all this adrenaline going through your system after pounding the nuclear industry for almost 3 hours. And we got everybody. Okay. Good night. Everybody, hooks for everybody. Have a great night. Great day tomorrow. Have a great day the day after. We'll see you on that day, I think. Just Sunday. There's lots of die-offs going on. Emaciated whales. Like, holy shit, man. Emaciated. Stories showing up the last couple of days. Anyway, I'm pretty burnt out. We'll see everybody on Sunday. Have a great night and a great weekend. Hugs for everybody. Thank you for finding time, the energy, and the effort If you made it this far, don't forget to give us a thumbs up. That's the best way, apparently, to share it. Costs as little, and it might actually go a long way. Have a great night. See everybody later. Take care now. J-Man. Gotcha. I got all of you that I seen there anyway. Take care, folks. We'll see everybody on Sunday night show.